In the shadow of golden gates that have witnessed centuries of power, betrayal, and forbidden love, one woman's desperate fight for acceptance will either shatter a kingdom's traditions forever or destroy everything she holds dear. When love collides with ancient laws, and family loyalty clashes with royal duty, the very foundations of the Valdoran Palace begin to tremble. This is the story of Celeste Moreau, a commoner who dared to love a prince, and the devastating price she paid when the crown decided she was unworthy of wearing it. But behind every closed door lies a secret, and sometimes the most broken hearts carry the power to rebuild entire kingdoms. What happens when a woman who has lost everything discovers she holds the one truth that could bring down the very people who destroyed her? In a world where bloodlines determine destiny, Celeste is about to prove that some bonds run deeper than royal blood, and some love stories are worth risking everything to tell. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble courtyard of Valdoran Palace, but Celeste Moreau felt only darkness in her heart. She stood at the ornate gates that had once welcomed her as Prince Adrian's beloved wife, now facing them as an exile. The golden bars that gleamed in the early light seemed to mock her with their beauty, a cruel reminder of the world she was being torn away from. Behind those gates lay everything that mattered to her: her husband of 3 years, her 2 young children, and a life she had fought so hard to build despite being born a commoner. Now, by order of Queen Isadora herself, that life was ending. The royal guards stood like statues in their crimson uniforms, their faces hidden behind ceremonial masks. Celeste had known some of these men personally, had shared kind words and warm smiles during happier times. Now they looked through her as if she were invisible, their loyalty bound to the crown that had commanded her removal. Captain Morrison, a man who had once bowed respectfully to her as Princess Celeste, now approached with a scroll bearing the royal seal. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he unrolled the parchment, and she caught a flicker of something that might have been regret in his eyes before his training took over. By royal decree of Her Majesty Queen Isadora of Valdoran, his voice carried across the courtyard with practiced authority, though Celeste noticed how he avoided meeting her gaze. Celeste Moreau is hereby banished from the kingdom, stripped of all titles and privileges, and forbidden from any contact with members of the royal family. This decree is effective immediately and shall remain in force for the remainder of her natural life. The words hit her like physical blows. Stripped of all titles, no contact with the royal family, the remainder of her natural life. Each phrase was carefully chosen to inflict maximum pain, to ensure she understood that this was not temporary anger, but permanent exile. "My children," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, I need to see my children." Captain Morrison's jaw tightened, and she saw him swallow hard before responding. "Princess Sophia and Prince Marcus will remain in the care of their grandmother, Her Majesty the Queen. They are to have no knowledge of your whereabouts or condition." The cruelty of it took her breath away. Sophia was only 5 years old, Marcus barely 3. They would wake this morning expecting their mother's kiss, her gentle voice reading them stories, her arms around them at bedtime. Instead, they would find only absence and whatever lies the Queen chose to tell them about where their mother had gone. "They're babies," Celeste pleaded, stepping closer to the gates. "Sophia still has nightmares. She needs me." "Marcus won't understand. The decision is final." Captain Morrison cut her off, but she heard the strain in his voice. Any attempt to contact the royal family or return to Valdoran territory will result in immediate imprisonment. Celeste gripped the golden bars of the gate, her knuckles white with the force of her desperation. Through the ornate metalwork, she could see the palace windows gleaming in the morning light. Somewhere behind one of those windows, her children were probably eating breakfast, perhaps asking where Mama was, perhaps crying for her. The thought of Adrian made her chest tight with a different kind of pain. Her husband, the man who had defied his mother to marry her, who had sworn he would always protect her, who had promised that love would conquer all the obstacles their different worlds presented. Where was he now? Why wasn't he fighting for her, for their family, for the promises they had made at their wedding altar? "What are the charges?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "What crime have I supposedly committed to deserve this?" Captain Morrison looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Conduct unbecoming of a member of the royal family. Bringing disgrace upon the crown." The vague accusations stung because they revealed the truth. There had been no crime, no real wrongdoing. This was about power, about Queen Isadora finally finding a way to remove the commoner daughter-in-law she had never accepted. The queen had waited 3 years, watching and planning, until she found the perfect moment to strike. That moment had come a week ago, when Celeste had been photographed at a charity event embracing a former lover, Henri Dubois, who was now a prominent diplomat. The photograph, taken from a carefully chosen angle, made their brief, innocent reunion look intimate and scandalous. The palace had leaked the image to the press with whispered rumors of an affair, and public opinion had turned swift and harsh. Celeste had tried to explain, had begged for a chance to tell the truth. Henri was married now with children of his own. Their conversation had lasted mere minutes, and their brief embrace had been nothing more than two old friends saying goodbye after years apart. But the queen had seized upon the scandal with ruthless efficiency, declaring that Celeste's betrayal of Prince Adrien was grounds for immediate banishment. "The prince," Celeste said quietly. "Does he know? Does he agree with this?" For the first time, Captain Morrison's professional mask slipped completely. Pain flashed across his features, and he looked away. "Prince Adrien is indisposed. He has not been consulted on this matter." The careful phrasing told her everything. Adrien was likely locked away somewhere in the palace, perhaps sedated, perhaps simply overwhelmed by the impossible choice between his mother and his wife. She knew him well enough to know he would be fighting this decision with everything he had. But Queen Isadora was cunning and powerful. She would have found ways to neutralize her son's ability to interfere. A movement at one of the palace windows caught Celeste's attention. A small figure pressed against the glass, barely visible at this distance. Her heart leaped as she recognized Sophia's distinctive red dress, the one with the golden ribbons that her daughter loved so much. The little girl seemed to be looking in their direction, perhaps drawn by the commotion in the courtyard. "Sophia," Celeste called out, waving frantically. "Mommy's here. Mommy loves you." The child at the window didn't respond, couldn't hear her voice across the vast distance. But Celeste kept waving, kept calling, until one of the palace staff members appeared and gently pulled the small figure away from the window. The curtains closed with swift finality. "Please," Celeste turned back to Captain Morrison, tears streaming down her face now. "I'm begging you. Let me see them one more time. Just to say goodbye. Just to explain that this isn't their fault, that Mommy still loves them." The old soldier's face was stone, but she could see the conflict raging behind his eyes. He had children of his own. She had met them at palace functions. He knew what it meant to love a child, to want to protect them from pain. "I have my orders," he said finally, but his voice was rough with emotion. "You must leave immediately." Behind him, she noticed that some of the younger guards were shifting uncomfortably. These were men who had watched her grow into her role as princess, who had seen her kindness to the palace staff, her genuine care for the people of Valdoran. They knew she was not the scheming adulteress the queen painted her to be. A black carriage waited at the edge of the courtyard, its windows tinted dark enough that no one could see inside. It would take her to the border, to a life of exile and uncertainty. She had been allowed to take only one small bag of personal belongings. Everything else, every gift Adrien had given her, every toy her children had played with, every photograph of their happy moments together, remained locked behind these golden gates. "The jewelry," Captain Morrison said awkwardly, gesturing to the modest necklace Adrien had given her for their second anniversary. "Royal gifts must remain with the crown." The request felt like the final insult, the last twist of the knife. With shaking hands, Celeste unclasped the delicate chain and let it fall to the marble stones. The small diamonds caught the light as they scattered, beautiful and worthless at the same time. As she walked toward the waiting carriage, her legs felt like lead. Each step took her further from everything she loved, from the life she had built against all odds. She could feel the eyes of the guards following her, some sympathetic, others coldly professional. Just before reaching the carriage door, she turned back one final time. The palace rose before her like a fairy tale castle, all golden spires and gleaming windows, beautiful enough to break your heart. Somewhere inside those walls, her children were learning to live without their mother. Somewhere inside, Adrien was discovering that love alone wasn't enough to protect the people you cared about most. The carriage door opened with a soft creak, revealing the dark interior that would carry her into exile. As she settled into the plush seats, Celeste made a silent promise to herself. This wasn't the end of her story. Somehow, someway, she would find a path back to her children. Queen Isadora might have won this battle, but the war for her family's future was far from over. The carriage lurched into motion, wheels clattering against the cobblestones as it carried her away from Valdoran Palace. Through the small rear window, She watched the golden gates grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely, taking with them the only life she had ever wanted. But, in her heart, a spark of defiance still burned bright. She was no longer Princess Celeste, no longer protected by royal privilege or bound by palace protocol. She was simply Celeste Moreau again, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. And sometimes, she thought as the palace faded into the distance, that was exactly the kind of person who changed the world. The cottage in Millbrook Village sat at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by wildflowers and ancient oak trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. It was a world away from the marble halls and crystal chandeliers of Valdoran Palace, but for Celeste Moreau, it had become both sanctuary and prison. 6 months had passed since her banishment, and she had learned to measure time differently now. Instead of royal engagements and state dinners marking her days, there were sunrise walks through meadows where no one knew her face, and quiet evenings by the fireplace where the only sound was her own breathing. The simplicity was both healing and heartbreaking. The cottage itself was modest but comfortable, provided by an old friend of her father's who asked no questions and demanded no explanations. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood had been her father's nurse during his final illness, and when word reached her about Celeste's situation, she had quietly offered refuge. The elderly woman lived in the main house on the property, while Celeste occupied the smaller cottage, an arrangement that gave her privacy while ensuring she wasn't completely alone. Each morning, Celeste woke to sunlight streaming through gingham curtains instead of silk drapes. She made her own breakfast instead of having it served on china plates, and she found unexpected comfort in these simple rituals. There was something honest about kneading bread dough with her own hands, something real about hanging laundry on the line behind the cottage. But the peaceful moments were always interrupted by thoughts of Sophia and Marcus. What stories were they being told about their mother's absence? Did they still ask for her at bedtime? Had they stopped looking for her in doorways and around corners? The not knowing was a constant ache in her chest, worse than any physical pain she had ever endured. To distract herself from the endless worry, Celeste had begun volunteering at the village school. The headmistress, Miss Catherine Green, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who cared more about Celeste's ability to help children learn than about her mysterious past. Under the name Celeste Martin, she taught reading to the younger students and helped with arithmetic lessons for the older ones. The children were a blessing and a torment. Their innocent laughter reminded her of Sophia's giggles, their scraped knees, and hurt feelings echoed Marcus's need for comfort. When 7-year-old Tommy Fletcher fell asleep during story time, his head heavy against her shoulder, she had to excuse herself to cry in the supply closet. But they also gave her purpose. These village children had so little compared to her own privileged offspring, yet they possessed a joy and resilience that humbled her. When Maria Santos struggled with her letters, Celeste worked patiently with her until the words began to make sense. When young Peter Williams was too shy to speak up in class, she found gentle ways to encourage his voice. "You're a natural teacher," Miss Green told her one afternoon as they watched the children play in the schoolyard. "Have you ever considered making it your profession?" Celeste smiled sadly. "I had other plans for my life. But perhaps this is where I'm meant to be now." She didn't mention that her previous career had been princess, wife, and mother to royal children. Some truths were too complicated for simple village conversations. The hardest part of exile wasn't the loss of luxury or status. It was the complete isolation from news about her family. Queen Isadora had been thorough in her banishment, ensuring that no information about Prince Adrian or the children reached Celeste through any channel. The village newspaper occasionally mentioned royal events, but always in the most general terms, with no personal details about the family she ached to know about. Sometimes, walking through the village market, she would catch glimpses of newspaper headlines featuring the royal family. Her heart would race, and she would move closer, desperate for any crumb of information. But the articles were always formal announcements about charitable events or state visits, never the intimate details she craved. Were her children healthy? Happy? Did they remember her voice, her laugh, the lullabies she used to sing? Mrs. Blackwood became her closest confidant during these difficult months, though Celeste revealed little about her past. The older woman seemed to understand that her guest carried deep wounds and needed time to heal. Their evening conversations over tea were gentle affairs, touching on books, gardening, and village gossip rather than painful memories. "Heartbreak changes a person," Mrs. Blackwood observed one evening as they sat by the fire. "But it doesn't have to destroy them. Sometimes it makes them stronger, more compassionate. Celeste nodded, thinking of the children at school, how their struggles had taught her patience she never knew she possessed. I used to think strength meant never showing weakness. Now I think it might mean continuing to love, even when love brings pain. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the village in pristine snow that reminded Celeste painfully of Christmas mornings at the palace. She remembered Sophia's excitement at finding presents under the tree, Marcus's wonder at the Christmas lights, Adrian's gentle kiss as they watched their children discover the magic of the season. This Christmas would be their first without her, and the thought was almost unbearable. Would Sophia still hang her stocking by the fireplace? Would Marcus remember the special Christmas cookies they used to bake together? Would Adrian find a way to make the holiday special despite the shadow of her absence? To cope with the overwhelming sadness, Celeste threw herself into preparing Christmas for the village children. She organized a holiday program at the school, teaching the students traditional songs and helping them create simple decorations from pine cones and ribbon. When she discovered that several families couldn't afford gifts for their children, she quietly arranged for anonymous donations using the small amount of money she had saved from her former life. "Miss Martin, you're crying," little Emma Walsh observed during rehearsal for the Christmas play. Celeste quickly wiped her eyes, embarrassed to be caught in her emotions by a 6-year-old. "I'm just so proud of how well you're all doing," she said, which was true, though not the whole truth. The night of the Christmas program, as she watched the children perform their simple songs and recite their carefully practiced poems, Celeste felt a bittersweet joy. These weren't her children, but they were children who needed love and encouragement, and she could provide that. Perhaps this was her purpose now, to nurture other people's children since she couldn't reach her own. After the program, as parents hugged their little performers and praised their efforts, Celeste stood alone at the back of the room. The ache of missing Sophia and Marcus was particularly sharp, watching other families celebrate together. "Thank you for what you've done for these children," a voice said beside her. She turned to find Dr. James Morrison, the village physician, holding his daughter's hand. The little girl, about Sophia's age, beamed up at Celeste with gap-toothed pride. "Miss Martin helped me read the big words," the child announced importantly. Dr. Morrison smiled. "Lucy's reading has improved remarkably since you started working with her. Whatever you did before coming to Millbrook, you clearly understand children." The casual comment hit closer to home than he could know. "I was a mother," she said simply. "I suppose the skills carry over." Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, because Dr. Morrison's expression grew gentle. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring up painful memories." Celeste shook her head. "They're not all painful. Being a mother was the best thing I ever did, even if—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. That night, alone in her cottage with snow falling softly outside the windows, Celeste allowed herself to grieve fully for the Christmas she was missing. She imagined Sophia carefully hanging ornaments on the palace tree, Marcus trying to peek at presents when no one was looking, Adrian reading them the night before Christmas in the grand library. But she also felt something new stirring alongside the grief, a sense of purpose that had been building throughout her months of exile. The children at the village school had shown her that she could still make a difference, still bring light to young lives, even if she couldn't reach her own children. As the new year approached, Celeste made a decision. She couldn't change the circumstances that had brought her to Millbrook, couldn't undo Queen Isadora's cruel banishment, couldn't magically return to her children. But she could choose how to move forward. She would stay in the village, at least for now, and build something meaningful from the ashes of her former life. She would become the teacher these children deserved, the stable presence they could count on. And somehow, someway, she would find a path back to Sophia and Marcus that didn't require breaking the law or putting them in danger. The thought of her children still brought tears to her eyes every day, and she suspected it always would. But alongside the tears now came determination. Queen Isadora might have taken away her title, her home, and her family, but she couldn't take away Celeste's capacity to love, to hope, to fight for a better future. As she drifted off to sleep that snowy night, Celeste whispered the same words she spoke every evening. "Good night, my darlings. Mama loves you and is working her way back to you. Please don't forget me." Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed midnight, marking another day in exile. But, for the first time in months, Celeste felt like she might be strong enough to face whatever came next. The letter arrived on a gray March morning, delivered by a nervous young man who stammered through an obvious alias before hurrying away. Celeste's hands shook as she broke the wax seal, recognizing the careful handwriting of Margaret Hartwell, who had been her personal secretary at the palace. The message was brief, but earth-shattering. The children ask for you every day. The prince grows thinner with worry. There are things you need to know. Meet me at St. Mary's Chapel in Westfield tomorrow at noon. Come alone and tell no one. Celeste read the letter 3 times before the full meaning sank in. After 8 months of complete isolation, someone was finally reaching out. But, more importantly, her children still remembered her, still asked for her. The knowledge that Sophia and Marcus hadn't forgotten their mother brought both relief and fresh heartbreak. St. Mary's Chapel was a small stone building 2 villages over from Millbrook, modest enough that 2 women meeting there wouldn't attract attention. Celeste told Mrs. Blackwood she was visiting a distant cousin and set out early, her heart racing with anticipation and fear. What news would Margaret bring? And why the secrecy? The chapel was empty except for Margaret, who sat in the last pew with her head bowed, as if in prayer. She looked older than Celeste remembered, her brown hair now streaked with gray, worry lines etched around her eyes. When she saw Celeste, she rose and embraced her former employer with tears streaming down her cheeks. "My lady, I've missed you so," Margaret whispered. "We all have. The palace hasn't been the same." They moved to a corner where they could speak quietly without being overheard. Margaret pulled out a small photograph, and Celeste gasped when she saw her children's faces looking back at her. Sophia had grown taller, her face more mature but still bearing that familiar impish smile. Marcus looked like a proper little boy now instead of a toddler, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression serious for the camera. "They took this at Easter," Margaret explained. "Princess Sophia insisted on wearing her blue dress because she said it was your favorite. Prince Marcus asked the photographer if the picture could be sent to heaven, because that's where grandmother told them you had gone." The casual cruelty of the lie hit Celeste like a physical blow. "They think I'm dead." Margaret nodded grimly. "Queen Isadora announced your death 3 months after the banishment. She claimed you had died in a carriage accident while traveling abroad, overcome with shame for your actions. There was even a memorial service." Celeste stared at the photograph through a haze of tears. Her babies thought she was dead. They had grieved for her, attended her funeral, perhaps even said goodbye to her memory. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty and genius. Dead mothers couldn't return to claim their children. What about Adrian? Surely he didn't believe. "Prince Adrian knows the truth," Margaret interrupted. "But he's been essentially imprisoned in the palace. The Queen has convinced the royal council that his grief over your betrayal and death has made him mentally unstable. He's under constant medical supervision and heavily medicated. When he tries to tell people you're alive, the doctors dismiss it as part of his delusion." The picture Margaret painted was horrifying. Adrian, who had always been strong and decisive, reduced to a shadow of himself, while their children grew up believing their mother was dead. Queen Isadora had orchestrated the perfect crime, destroying their family while maintaining the appearance of royal dignity. "There's more," Margaret continued, glancing around to ensure they were still alone. "I've been investigating what really happened that night you were banished. The photograph that started everything, the one of you with Henri Dubois? It was staged." Celeste looked up sharply. "What do you mean, staged?" Margaret pulled out a manila envelope from her handbag. "I found this hidden in the Queen's private office. I know I could lose my position, maybe even face criminal charges, but I couldn't stand by and watch this injustice continue." Inside the envelope were multiple photographs, contact sheets, and what appeared to be planning documents. The images showed the charity event from various angles, but, more importantly, they showed Henri Dubois arriving with a woman who looked remarkably similar to Celeste from a distance. The woman was positioned strategically to be photographed embracing Henri, creating the illusion of intimacy. "The Queen hired an actress," Margaret explained. "Someone who could pass for you from far away, especially with careful makeup and the right clothing. The photographer was paid to be in exactly the right position to capture the image that would destroy your reputation." Celeste studied the photographs with growing amazement and rage. The setup had been elaborate and expensive, requiring weeks of planning and coordination. But it had been flawlessly executed, creating scandal where none existed and providing Queen Isadora with the ammunition she needed to banish the daughter-in-law she despised. "This is evidence of a massive conspiracy," Celeste breathed. If this came to light, the Queen would deny everything. She'd claim these photographs were forgeries created by someone trying to damage the crown's reputation. Without more proof, it would be our word against hers. and she holds all the power. Margaret was right, but the revelation still changed everything. Celeste wasn't a disgraced adulteress living in deserved exile. She was the victim of an elaborate frame job designed to destroy her family. The knowledge didn't immediately solve her problems, but it shifted her understanding of the situation entirely. What about supporters in the palace? Are there others who question what happened? Margaret nodded cautiously. Some of the older staff members remember how happy the prince was after he married you, how good you were with the children. Captain Morrison has been asking uncomfortable questions about the investigation into your supposed affair. And there are rumors that some members of the Royal Council are concerned about the prince's treatment. But they're afraid to speak out. Queen Isadora has been removing anyone who shows even mild sympathy for your situation. 3 senior staff members have been dismissed in the past month for disloyalty. The message is clear: support the official story or lose your livelihood. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Celeste's mind raced through possibilities, searching for a path forward that wouldn't put Margaret or her children in danger. I need to see them, Celeste said finally. I need my children to know I'm alive. Margaret's face went pale. My lady, that would be incredibly dangerous. The palace security has been tripled since your banishment. If you're caught, I'll be imprisoned or worse, Celeste finished. I understand the risks. But, Margaret, my children think I'm dead. They're growing up believing their mother abandoned them, and then died in disgrace. I can't let that continue, not when I know the truth. Even if you could reach them, what would you tell them? They're so young, and they've been through so much already. Learning that their grandmother has been lying to them about your death would be traumatic, Celeste agreed. But not as traumatic as spending their entire childhood believing their mother didn't love them enough to stay alive. Margaret pulled out another envelope, this one containing what appeared to be architectural drawings. If you're determined to try this, there might be a way. The old servants' passages that run through the palace walls haven't been used in decades, but they're still accessible if you know where to look. I've been mapping them during my off hours. Celeste studied the drawings with growing excitement. The passages created a hidden network throughout the palace, connecting rooms and allowing discrete movement between floors. If she could access the system, she might be able to reach the children's wing without being detected by the guards. This passage here, Margaret pointed to a route highlighted in red ink, leads directly to the nursery wing. The entrance is through the old pantry in the kitchen basement, and the exit is behind a bookshelf in the children's playroom. The staff rarely uses that room after 8 in the evening. When do the children go to bed? Princess Sophia at 8:30, Prince Marcus at 8. But they often play quietly for an hour afterward. If you could get to them around 9 o'clock. The plan was taking shape, dangerous and desperate, but possible. Celeste would need to study the passages, time her approach perfectly, and find a way to explain to her children that everything they'd been told was a lie without traumatizing them further. I'll need more information about their routines, about who has access to the nursery wing, about, I can get that, Margaret assured her. But, please, my lady, think carefully about this. If something goes wrong, it won't just be your freedom at stake. The Queen's rage would fall on anyone suspected of helping you. Celeste took Margaret's hands in hers, squeezing them gently. I would never put you in danger intentionally. If there's any risk to you, there's already risk just meeting like this, Margaret interrupted. But some things are more important than safety. Those children deserve to know their mother loves them. Prince Adrian deserves to know he's not losing his mind. And you deserve a chance to reclaim your family. They spent another hour going over details, discussing timing, and planning how Margaret could gather the additional information Celeste would need. When they finally parted ways, Celeste felt something she hadn't experienced in months, hope mixed with purpose. The ride back to Millbrook gave her time to process everything she'd learned. Queen Isadora's manipulation had been even more elaborate and cruel than she'd imagined, but it also meant there was evidence of the deception. Margaret's loyalty provided her with an ally inside the palace, and the servants' passages offered a potential path to her children. The risks were enormous. If caught, she would face imprisonment or exile to a much harsher location. Margaret would lose her position and possibly face criminal charges. But the alternative was allowing her children to grow up believing their mother had betrayed and abandoned them, allowing Adrian to waste away under forced medication, allowing Queen Isadora's lies to become the permanent truth of their family story. That night, Celeste sat by her cottage window looking up at the stars and thinking about Sophia and Marcus. Somewhere beyond those stars, Her children were sleeping in their palace beds, perhaps still having nightmares about their dead mother, perhaps slowly forgetting her voice and her touch. "I'm coming," she whispered to the darkness. "I don't know how yet, and I don't know what will happen, but I'm coming. Mama's going to fix this." For the first time since her banishment, Celeste felt like herself again, not a victim, not an exile, but a mother fighting for her children. And that, she realized, made her more dangerous than Queen Isadora could possibly imagine. The night was moonless and thick with fog when Celeste approached the walls of Valdoran Palace for the first time in 10 months. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crouched in the shadows of the old stable building, watching the guards make their rounds. Margaret had provided detailed timing charts for the patrol schedules, but theory was different from the terrifying reality of sneaking into the most secure building in the kingdom. She wore dark clothing borrowed from Mrs. Blackwood's late husband, her hair hidden under a knit cap that made her look like any other village worker. In her small pack, she carried rope, a flashlight, and, most importantly, a music box she had bought in the village market. It played the same lullaby she used to sing to Sophia and Marcus, a melody she hoped would help convince them she was real and not a dream. The entrance to the servants' passages was exactly where Margaret had indicated, a small door hidden behind overgrown ivy near the old kitchen building. The lock had rusted with age, but Margaret had oiled it during her reconnaissance trips, and it opened with only the slightest squeak. The passage beyond was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for one person. Celeste switched on her flashlight, keeping the beam low as she began the treacherous journey through walls she had once lived within but never known existed. The stone floor was uneven and covered with decades of dust that muffled her footsteps but made her sneeze. Following Margaret's carefully drawn map, she navigated a maze of turns and stairways that seemed to wind endlessly through the palace infrastructure. Sometimes she heard voices or footsteps through the walls, reminding her that just inches away, the palace staff went about their evening routines, unaware that a banished princess was creeping through their midst. The passage to the children's wing was particularly challenging, requiring her to climb a narrow ladder and crawl through a space barely large enough for her body. Her hands were scraped and dirty by the time she reached the hidden panel behind the bookshelf in the playroom, but her determination never wavered. Every difficult inch brought her closer to her children. She waited in the darkness behind the wall for what felt like hours, listening for signs that the room beyond was empty. The palace was settling into its nighttime quiet, and she could hear the distant chiming of the clock tower, marking 9:30. According to Margaret's information, the children should be in their bedrooms by now, possibly still awake, but certainly without supervision from the nannies who went off duty at 9. When she was certain the playroom was empty, Celeste carefully pushed against the hidden panel. It swung open silently, revealing the familiar space where her children had spent countless hours building block castles and having tea parties with their stuffed animals. The room looked exactly as she remembered, except for one heartbreaking detail, a small shrine in the corner with her photograph surrounded by flowers and drawings. Sophia and Marcus had created a memorial to their supposedly dead mother, complete with crayon pictures labeled "Mama in Heaven" and "I miss you." The sight nearly brought Celeste to her knees with grief and rage at Queen Isadora's cruelty. The children's bedrooms were connected to the playroom by a short hallway. Celeste moved like a ghost through the familiar space, past the bathroom where she used to help them brush their teeth, past the reading nook where they had shared bedtime stories. Everything was achingly familiar, yet forever changed by her absence. Sophia's room was first, decorated in the pink and gold theme her daughter had chosen for her 5th birthday. Celeste peered around the doorframe and saw her little girl sitting up in bed, arms wrapped around a stuffed rabbit that Celeste recognized as one she had given Sophia as a comfort object. "Can't sleep, sweetheart?" Celeste whispered softly. Sophia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and fear. She opened her mouth to scream, but Celeste quickly stepped into the light where her daughter could see her face clearly. "It's okay, darling. It's Mama. Mama's dead," Sophia said flatly, but her voice shook with uncertainty. "Grandmother showed us your grave." Celeste's heart broke at the matter-of-fact way her 6-year-old daughter delivered this information. She approached the bed slowly, hands visible, speaking in the gentle tone she had always used during bedtime routines. "I'm not dead, sweetheart. I'm very much alive, and I've missed you so terribly." She pulled the music box from her pack and wound it up. The familiar lullaby began to play, the same melody that had comforted Sophia through countless nights. Recognition dawned in Sophia's eyes, followed by confusion and, then, desperate hope. Mama? Is it really you? It's really me, my darling girl. Celeste sat carefully on the edge of the bed, not wanting to overwhelm her daughter with too much too quickly. You've grown so tall. And look how long your hair has gotten. Sophia reached out tentatively to touch Celeste's face, as if testing whether she was real. When her small fingers made contact with warm skin, the little girl threw herself into her mother's arms with a sob. I knew you weren't dead. I knew it. I told everyone, but they said I was being silly and that you were in heaven with the angels. But I knew you were somewhere else. Celeste held her daughter tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her small body. I'm so sorry I've been away, sweetheart. I wanted to come back sooner, but it was very complicated. Where were you? Why did grandmother say you were dead? Why didn't you write me letters? The questions came in a rush, and Celeste struggled to find age-appropriate answers. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense to children. I was sent away, but not because I wanted to leave you and Marcus. I would never choose to be away from you. Before Sophia could ask more questions, a small voice came from the doorway. Sophia? Who are you talking to? Marcus stood in the hallway in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing sleepy eyes. At 3.5 now, he looked like a proper little boy instead of the toddler Celeste remembered. Her breath caught as she realized how much of his growth she had missed. Marcus, she called softly. Come here, sweetheart. He approached cautiously, studying her face with the serious expression that had always been his trademark. Unlike Sophia, who wore her emotions openly, Marcus had always been more reserved, thinking carefully before reacting. I know you, he said finally. You're in the pictures in Mama's memory corner. The phrase broke Celeste's heart all over again. Her 3-year-old son knew her only from photographs in a memorial shrine. I'm your mama, she said gently. I've been away, but I came back to see you. Marcus looked confused, glancing between Celeste and Sophia. But Mama is dead. Grandmother told us. We had a funeral with flowers and everything. Sophia grabbed her little brother's hand, pulling him closer to the bed. She's not dead, Marcus. Look, she's right here. She brought our music box. Celeste wound up the music box again, hoping the familiar melody would trigger memories for Marcus. As the lullaby played, she saw recognition flicker in his eyes. Night-night song, he whispered, then looked up at her with wonder. You used to sing the night-night song. That's right, sweetheart. I used to sing it to you every night before bed. Celeste opened her arms, and, after a moment's hesitation, Marcus climbed onto the bed and let her hold him. Having both her children in her arms again was overwhelming. Celeste had imagined this moment countless times during her exile, but the reality was both more wonderful and more heartbreaking than her fantasies. They were real and warm and alive, but they had been living with the belief that she was dead, that she had abandoned them. Are you going to stay now? Sophia asked anxiously. Are you going to live with us again? The question Celeste had been dreading. I wish I could, darling, but it's complicated. There are some grown-up problems that need to be solved first. What kind of problems? Marcus asked, always practical. How could she explain royal politics and Queen Isadora's manipulation to children so young? Sometimes people believe things that aren't true, and it takes time to help them understand what really happened. They talked quietly for another hour, Celeste answering what questions she could and deflecting others that were too complex or painful. She told them about the village where she was living, about the children she taught at the school, about how much she missed them every single day. I think about you when I wake up in the morning and when I go to sleep at night, she promised them. Even when we can't be together, I love you more than all the stars in the sky. More than all the fish in the sea? Sophia asked, reciting their old bedtime ritual. More than all the fish in the sea, Celeste confirmed, kissing the top of her daughter's head. More than all the leaves on the trees? Marcus added, remembering his part. More than all the leaves on the trees, she assured him, pulling him closer. As the palace clock chimed 11, Celeste knew she had to leave. The longer she stayed, the greater the risk of discovery, and she couldn't bear the thought of being caught and separated from her children again. I have to go now, she said gently. But I want you to remember that everything I told you tonight is true. I'm alive, I love you, and I'm working very hard to come home to stay. When? Sophia demanded. When will you come home for real? I don't know exactly when, but I promise I'm trying. And I want you to know that no matter what anyone tells you, I will never stop fighting to be with you both. She made them promise to keep her visit secret for now, explaining that there were people who didn't want them to be together and that they needed to be very careful. Both children nodded solemnly, understanding that this was serious grown-up business even if they didn't fully comprehend the details. The goodbye was excruciating. Both children clung to her, begging her not to leave, and Celeste had to summon every ounce of strength to pull away. She promised to try to visit again if she could, gave them each a small token she had brought from the village, and tucked them back into their beds. "Sweet dreams, my darlings," she whispered, kissing each forehead. "Remember that Mama loves you always." The journey back through the servants' passages felt longer and more treacherous than before, partly because she was emotionally drained and partly because the fog had thickened, making the return trip to the entrance more dangerous. But she made it safely, slipping away from the palace grounds just as the midnight patrol began their rounds. The ride back to Millbrook gave her time to process the enormous step she had just taken. Her children knew she was alive now, knew she loved them, and was fighting to return. That knowledge would help them, but it also created new complications. How long could two young children keep such a momentous secret? And what would happen if Queen Isadora discovered that her carefully constructed lie had been exposed? But as Celeste finally reached her cottage and collapsed into bed, exhausted and exhilarated, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her banishment: hope. The reunion had been brief and bittersweet, but it had rekindled the fire in her heart. Her children knew the truth now, and that changed everything. Tomorrow, she would begin planning her next move. Margaret's evidence of the conspiracy was a start, but they would need more proof, more allies, and a strategy that could overcome Queen Isadora's seemingly unshakable power. But tonight, for the first time in months, Celeste fell asleep smiling. She had held her children again, had seen their faces light up with joy and recognition. Whatever happened next, they knew their mother was alive and fighting for them. And sometimes, that knowledge was enough to change the world. The revelation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Edmund Harwick, the royal physician who had been overseeing Prince Adrian's treatment, arrived at Celeste's cottage on a rain-soaked April morning with documents that would shake the kingdom to its foundations. Margaret had introduced them carefully, arranging a meeting in the same chapel where Celeste had first learned the truth about her exile. Dr. Harwick was a man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the weight of guilt he carried was visible in every line of his weathered face. "I have been complicit in a terrible injustice," he began without preamble, his voice heavy with remorse. "For months, I administered medications to Prince Adrian that were meant to keep him docile and confused. I was told it was for his own good, that grief had made him unstable. But I've begun to suspect the truth is far more sinister." Celeste listened with growing horror as Dr. Harwick described the elaborate medical charade that had been used to silence her husband. Adrian had been given powerful sedatives and mood stabilizers that made him appear mentally unfit whenever he tried to challenge his mother's version of events. When he insisted that Celeste was alive and had been framed, the medications made him seem delusional. "The breaking point came last week," Dr. Harwick continued, "when the prince managed to reduce his medication dosage without my knowledge. He was lucid for the first time in months, and he confronted me with evidence he had been secretly gathering." The doctor pulled out a thick folder containing medical records, correspondence between Queen Isadora and various physicians, and, most damning of all, financial records showing payments to the actress who had impersonated Celeste in the stage photographs. "Prince Adrian never believed you were guilty," Dr. Harwick explained. Even under heavy sedation, he continued investigating. He discovered the same evidence Margaret found, plus additional proof of the conspiracy. "The Queen has been paying substantial sums to at least 6 different people to maintain the fiction of your disgrace and death." Celeste studied the documents with amazement. Adrian had been fighting for her even when his own mother had him chemically restrained. The depth of his loyalty and love, even in the face of such manipulation, brought tears to her eyes. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Under increased medical supervision," Dr. Harwick said grimly. When the Queen realized he was becoming lucid, she ordered stronger medications. "But I've been giving him placebos instead. He's weak from months of inappropriate treatment, but his mind is clear for the first time since your banishment." The plan that emerged from their conversation was both simple and audacious. Dr. Harwick would continue to pretend Adrian was sedated while secretly helping him gather strength. Margaret would use her position to document additional evidence of the conspiracy. and Celeste would prepare to make a public return that would expose Queen Isidora's lies in the most dramatic way possible. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The kingdom's annual Founders' Day celebration was approaching, an event where the entire royal family appeared before the public to commemorate the nation's history. This year, the ceremony would be especially significant because Sophia was old enough to participate for the first time, and the palace had planned elaborate festivities to introduce the young princess to the people. If you appeared at the ceremony, Margaret suggested during one of their secret meetings, if the people saw you alive in front of the television cameras, Queen Isidora couldn't maintain the fiction that you're dead. It was incredibly risky. The ceremony would be heavily guarded, and Celeste would have no legal protection if she was arrested before she could present her evidence. But it was also the perfect stage for revealing the truth. Thousands of people would witness her return, making it impossible for the Queen to silence her quietly. Dr. Harwick provided the final piece of the puzzle. Prince Adrian will be expected to attend the ceremony despite his supposed condition. I can arrange for him to have a moment of unexpected clarity at exactly the right time. If you both appear together with the evidence we've gathered. The weeks leading up to Founders' Day were tense with preparation. Margaret smuggled additional documents from the palace archives, building an irrefutable case against the Queen's conspiracy. Dr. Harwick carefully managed Adrian's treatment, ensuring he would be strong enough for what was to come. And Celeste practiced her speech, knowing she would have only minutes to present her case before the authorities moved to silence her. The most difficult part was the uncertainty about her children's safety. If the plan failed, Queen Isidora's rage would know no bounds, and Sophia and Marcus could become pawns in an even more vicious game. But they were already prisoners of the Queen's lies, and Celeste couldn't bear the thought of them growing up believing their mother was a betrayer who had died in disgrace. On the morning of Founders' Day, Celeste made her way to the capital city where the ceremony would take place in the Grand Square before the royal cathedral. She wore a simple blue dress, the same color as the gown she had worn for her first official portrait as princess. Hidden in her handbag were copies of all the evidence they had gathered, ready to be distributed to the press if she had the opportunity. The ceremony began with traditional pageantry, military bands, colorful banners, and crowds of people waving enthusiastically as the royal family took their places on the decorated platform. Celeste watched from the crowd, her heart racing as she saw her children for the first time since her secret visit to the palace. Sophia looked beautiful in a white dress with golden ribbons, standing straight and proud beside her grandmother. Marcus wore a miniature version of his father's ceremonial uniform, though he seemed overwhelmed by the crowds and noise. Both children appeared healthy but subdued, lacking the joy and energy Celeste remembered. Prince Adrian stood beside his mother, dressed in full royal regalia, but moving with the careful slowness of someone still recovering from prolonged sedation. Even at a distance, Celeste could see that he had lost weight, and that his face bore the marks of strain and sorrow. Queen Isidora commanded the ceremony with her usual regal bearing, addressing the crowd with words about tradition, duty, and the strength of the royal family. She spoke eloquently about overcoming tragedy and finding hope in times of loss, her voice carrying clearly through the public address system. As the Queen's speech reached its climax, Celeste began moving through the crowd toward the platform. Palace guards were positioned throughout the square, but their attention was focused on potential external threats, not on a simply dressed woman emerging from the crowd. The moment came when Queen Isidora introduced Sophia to the people as the next generation of royal leadership. Princess Sophia represents our kingdom's bright future, she declared, raised with the values of duty and honor despite the tragic loss of her mother. The only tragedy, Celeste called out in a voice that carried clearly across the square, is that my children have been raised to believe their mother is dead. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people turned to see who had spoken. On the platform, Queen Isidora's face went white with shock and rage. Sophia and Marcus stared in disbelief at their supposedly dead mother standing before them in broad daylight. But it was Adrian's reaction that mattered most. Despite months of chemical sedation and manipulation, he recognized his wife immediately. "Celeste," he said, his voice carrying through the microphone system. "You're alive." Palace guards moved to intercept Celeste, but the crowd had realized what was happening and surged forward, creating chaos that made it impossible for security to reach her quickly. Television cameras, which had been broadcasting the ceremony live, swung toward the woman who had just claimed to be the dead princess. "I am Princess Celeste of Valdoran," she announced clearly, speaking to the cameras as much as the crowd. "I was banished from this kingdom 11 months ago based on fabricated evidence of adultery. I was not dead in a carriage accident. I have been living in exile while my children were told I had died in disgrace." Queen Isadora tried to regain control of the situation, but her voice was drowned out by the crowd's reaction. Some people cheered, others demanded explanations, and the entire ceremony dissolved into chaos as the implications of Celeste's appearance became clear. Margaret appeared beside Celeste as if from nowhere, carrying boxes of documents and photographs. "The evidence," she called out to the gathered reporters. "Everything is here. The staged photographs, the financial records, the medical documentation of Prince Adrian's forced sedation." Dr. Harwick stepped forward from the crowd as well, his physician's credentials lending weight to his testimony. "I have treated Prince Adrian for months with medications designed to keep him confused and docile. Queen Isadora ordered this treatment to prevent him from investigating his wife's banishment." The revelation created an uproar that no amount of royal protocol could contain. As television cameras rolled and reporters shouted questions, the carefully constructed fiction of Celeste's disgrace and death crumbled in real time. On the platform, Sophia broke free from her handlers and ran toward her mother. "Mama, I knew you weren't dead. I told them, but they wouldn't listen." The image of the little princess running to embrace her supposedly dead mother, broadcast live to the entire kingdom, became the defining moment that brought down Queen Isadora's conspiracy. No amount of political maneuvering could overcome the visual evidence of a mother reunited with her children. Marcus followed his sister more cautiously, but when Celeste knelt down and opened her arms, he ran to her as well. The reunion, captured by dozens of cameras, was both joyful and heartbreaking as the children clung to the mother they had mourned. Adrian, moving with visible effort but growing stronger with each step, descended from the platform and made his way through the crowd to his family. When he reached them, the reunion was complete. The family that Queen Isadora had tried to destroy stood together before the kingdom, alive and united. The aftermath moved quickly. Faced with overwhelming evidence and public outcry, Queen Isadora's support crumbled within hours. Royal Council members who had enabled her conspiracy scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. By evening, she had been placed under house arrest pending investigation into charges of fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of power. Prince Adrian, his legal authority restored once the truth about his forced medication became public, immediately revoked all orders related to Celeste's banishment. The staged photographs were revealed as forgeries. The actress who had impersonated Celeste came forward to confess her role in the conspiracy, and the full scope of Queen Isadora's manipulation was exposed. That night, for the first time in nearly a year, Celeste tucked her children into their beds at the palace. Sophia chattered excitedly about everything that had happened, while Marcus asked serious questions about where his mother had been and why grandmother had lied to them. "Sometimes people do wrong things because they're afraid or angry," Celeste explained gently. "Grandmother was wrong to lie to you, but that doesn't mean she didn't love you in her own way." "Will she go to prison?" Sophia asked with 6-year-old directness. "I don't know, sweetheart, but she won't be able to hurt our family anymore." Adrian joined them for the bedtime routine they had shared before the nightmare began. He was still weak from months of inappropriate medication, but his eyes were clear and filled with the love that had sustained him through his darkest period. After the children were asleep, Celeste and Adrian sat together in the garden where they had often walked during happier times. The palace around them was buzzing with activity as staff and officials dealt with the aftermath of the day's revelations. But in their small corner of the garden, there was finally peace. "I never stopped believing in you," Adrian told her, taking her hand. "Even when the medications made everything fuzzy, even when my own memories felt unreliable, I knew in my heart that you would never betray us." "I never stopped fighting to come back," Celeste replied. "There were moments when I almost gave up hope, but the thought of Sophia and Marcus believing I had abandoned them kept me going. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be legal proceedings, political ramifications, and the challenging work of healing the trauma that Queen Isadora's conspiracy had inflicted on their family. The children would need help processing the lies they had been told. Adrian would need time to fully recover from the medications, and Celeste would have to find her place in a palace that had been turned against her. But as they sat together under the stars, with their children safe in their beds and the truth finally revealed, Celeste felt something she had almost forgotten: complete happiness. She had fought against impossible odds and won not just her freedom, but her family's future. The banished princess had returned home not as a victim, but as a victor. And sometimes the greatest victory of all was simply the chance to tuck your children into bed and promise them that tomorrow would be better than today. In the weeks that followed, Queen Isadora was quietly stripped of her titles and exiled to a remote estate, her conspiracy exposed, but her punishment kept private to avoid further damage to the monarchy's reputation. The kingdom rallied around Prince Adrian and Princess Celeste, who became symbols of resilience and the triumph of truth over manipulation. Celeste never forgot the village children who had helped her heal during her exile, and she established a foundation to support education in rural communities. Margaret was promoted to head of palace administration. Dr. Harwick became the royal family's trusted physician, and Captain Morrison, who had shown quiet sympathy during the darkest days, was commended for his integrity. But the most important victory was measured not in political outcomes or public recognition, but in the sound of Sophia and Marcus laughing as they played in the garden, in Adrian's strength returning day by day, and in the knowledge that their family had survived the worst that power and hatred could inflict. Love, it turned out, really could conquer all. It just sometimes required more courage than anyone imagined possible.